I think an interesting topic would be what we discussed when we started our relationship and we went through all the different topics which are important for us and kind of making sure that we are aligned on, or that we have an idea what the other person at least believes, or what the expectations are, goals are, what the abilities are.
I think we're very privileged that we had the foresight to actually have those conversations, because I think it kind of sets a compass for your relationship going forward. And I think it's always difficult in the beginning of a relationship because people don't want to have those kind of discussions, because it's maybe sort of an indication to somebody that you're taking this seriously, and maybe you don't know if the other person feels the same. They're actually really, really important conversations to have.
A lot of people don't want to have these conversations because you might tap into some topics which are uncomfortable, or might be something where you are not necessarily very open about what you think, right? Whether it's finances, could be sex, could be religious, spiritual aspects, whatever it is, right? And so some people just don't want to talk about these things and keep them for themselves. But I think it makes it even more important to just openly discuss these topics, because if you don't and you have a mismatch, then it's going to get quickly to the point in the relationship where you'll find out that you have a challenge there. And if you haven't addressed it, let's say on good terms, it's going to be even harder when you get into a situation where there's tension, where you don't want to open up. And then that's going to be an even bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you said, it's a good idea to have these discussions while things are good, and while you are in love and are having a good time together, and also just exploring what's important to each other, and, where do your values lie? How do you want to prioritize certain aspects of your relationship or your life? And I agree with you. I think often people don't want to have these discussions because perhaps they're scared of, it goes back to vulnerability, right? They're scared of being vulnerable, of being open. I think sometimes people also don't really know how they feel about a topic. So I think that that's invaluable to explore it together and to talk about it together.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So
when we started talking, I mean, what were the topics that we covered in our discussions? Because what we actually did was we went through
those questions, right?
So all the questions, in a way, the basis of all of that was this document that we created.
Yeah.
Like 10 years ago. I had made an initial, no, not initial, where I had made an intentional effort to really write down all of the aspects that are important to me in all areas of life. How I want my relationship to be, how I want my professional career to be, how I want my relationship with my kids to be, how I want to live, like all areas. And then I wrote it down, created a document with all, like I was designing my perfect life. How would my perfect life look like if I were to write it down, and if I were to completely design it from scratch. And I went into an incredible amount of detail for all of this. So really wrote down exactly what car do you want to drive, how much you want to earn, how do I want my kids' room to look like, how do I want to live, how do I want to spend my spare time, how do I want to eat, how do I want to train, like literally everything. And then for some years, I kept going back to the document on a regular basis. So I would review this maybe once a month, maybe every other month, and see what I had achieved. Like what were the things that I could actually check off, or need to maybe review, or to adapt, or where I changed my beliefs maybe, or changed my approach or my view on things, or my view on the world.
I remember you reading some of what you'd written down, and I remember saying to you that so much of what you had in your document, which was beautifully laid out and really, really well thought out, but so much of it was material things or physical things. I remember saying to you, I think that the important thing to look at is, what are the values that underpin that, and why are those things important to you? What do they mean to you?
Yes.
And I think that it's one thing to think about what your ideal physical life looks like. What does your ideal home look like? What does your ideal wife look like, or your ideal relationship look like? But at the end of the day, I think one has to explore, what are your most important values? What's most important to you?
What is this rooted in, essentially?
What's it rooted in? And why? Why do you want that home? Why do you want that car? Why do you want that income? Because I think if one can't explore the underlying values associated with those things, they just become empty, hollow material things that don't have any real meaning and don't really bring you any happiness or contentment. So I remember we had whole discussions around values and why we wanted those things in our lives. And I think that those were really, really valuable discussions and conversations as well.
Yeah, and I think we really made an effort to, so we did two things. The first, I think we started with essentially an empty sheet of paper, figuratively, because we wrote it down in a computer file and made some notes while we were discussing it. But we went through all these categories first, but then we also did the Jordan Peterson program, right? Where it's a lot about how do you plan your life to be, what is your ideal future from these perspectives, and what are the things you want to avoid, what are the things where things could go wrong.
And talk about them before they go wrong.
Correct, yes. And that also led in what you just said, what's the underlying agreement or not that we have about any of these topics, right?
Yeah.
I think we went from everything through religion, which was easy for us because there's nothing to discuss, to, sex, literally like, what do we want? How often do we want it? Do we feel comfortable? We don't feel comfortable.
Very valuable discussions, because I think it really helped us to understand each other better and understand where the other one was coming from. And it then helps you to sort of manage your expectations of the other person, or understand what your expectations are that the other person has of you. And I think that those are incredibly valuable conversations that we had in the beginning.
And I think we can both attest to the fact that we were coming from relationships where these discussions didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then, although there were great relationships at some point in the past, eventually the relationship fell apart, right? Because there was just no consensus and there was no culture of discussing these things.
And no openness, and you sort of hadn't established a baseline of being able to be honest and be able to express your needs or your expectations, and in a way that you felt heard. And like you said, you weren't in a position of conflict. We weren't in a position of conflict when we had these discussions.
Yeah.
And so I think it does make it harder if you haven't had those initial discussions, to then, when you're in a difficult situation, or when you're not happy, or when your expectations are not being met, or you don't understand why the other person's withdrawn, or why they're upset, or why they're miserable, or why they're stressed, or any of those things. I think we then have a tendency to shut the other one out because we hurt, or because we have these expectations that aren't being met.
We don't feel hurt. That's another important part. To learn that you are hurt when it's not critical, right? Because that's a very important part, because then and I've seen this at some point in my former relationship where I didn't feel hurt, but we never created a culture in our relationship back then, in my previous relationship, to openly discuss stuff. And when I was bringing up these things, it was, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, and I'm not judging that in any way from a former partner. It's just that she said, well, it was fine until now, so why are you complaining now? And I don't care, right? And so that then becomes an issue, because there's no culture of discussing things, and now it's too late, because there's feelings hurts, and there's
unmet
expectations. There's a mismatch in expectations, and then it becomes super critical. And that was actually, in my case, the beginning of the end of my former marriage, right? And this culture of discussing tough topics, it is super helpful, because we've seen this recently where there was one incident where we had different expectations about something, and what happened was that it's triggered, let's say, an old trauma in me. And so I reacted in a way because I felt I was, let's say, denied that need, although I rationally knew what was happening and why it was happening. That triggered something in me, like a trauma from a previous relationship, where I often felt like I'm not being heard, and my needs are not being respected, or
you're being rejected.
Or being rejected outright, right? And so when that happened, I reacted the same way I used to react in my relationship, which was a learned behavior where I would go in this almost sulking mode, because in the previous relationship, that was the only way to get myself hurt, right? And so I reacted the same way with you. And what that caused was that you felt rejected by me, and because of that, and that triggered your own trauma, right? So we had this stupid little discussion about something.
Trauma is
completely irrelevant, technically, which
wasn't irrelevant. It was relevant, but it was just.
Yes, you're right.
But I think your point is that because we've spoken about these things previously, and because we've been able to be vulnerable with each other before, and been very honest with each other about all of these things before, that enabled us to actually then have an open and adult and meaningful conversation about it the next day. And we could
and also
understand each other, and then our previous experiences, and we understood where the other one was coming from. And we could also then, I think, mend that little mini rupture quite quickly.
Yes, and a big part of being able to resolve it eventually in one discussion and be done with it was that we were both able to, instead of retracting and not talking about it, to just openly say, look, here's what happened, here's what was triggered in me, here's why I reacted the way I reacted, here's how I reacted, why I reacted how I reacted. That's good. Why is it coming back? Wait, I set it on follow from a distance mode.
Okay.
Yes, let me say it again. The reason why we were able to resolve this so quickly was that we had learned before to have these open discussions and to open up about our feelings and emotions in a safe environment. So when that happened, it was easy for us to just address what we really felt and open up, very brutally honest about why this happened, what we were feeling because of that. And that made it, in essence, super easy to just understand, here's what's happening with me, here's what this did to me from an emotional perspective, and from a rational perspective as well. Yeah. And the same for you, right? Yeah. Here's why you reacted the way you reacted from your previous relationship trauma. And then it was a matter of, okay, so now we know what is causing that, or how this manifests.
We reacted like we did, and we could acknowledge that in a loving and kind way, because we also had a deep understanding, I think, of the other person's perspective. I think that really helped.
No, absolutely.
And I think if we hadn't had those previous discussions, if we hadn't talked about these things months ago, it wouldn't have been repaired as quickly as it was. Without a doubt, I think there would have been things lingering, and I think if there were things lingering still, I think we would still talk about it. It's not to say that everything gets resolved in one discussion.
No, exactly. So some things you cannot simply resolve because there is something deeper going on, that if there's something that took years to build up, and a trauma or an emotion that took years to build in a positive or negative way, then that pops up. It's not like you can just talk about it and then hug and then it's fine, right? It's gone, right? It takes a while to work with that. But what it certainly does, it makes you more aware of your partner's needs.
Yeah.
And if you're more aware, you can either avoid the same thing from happening, or if it's not avoidable because it is what it is, then at least you know what this might trigger, and then be a bit more conscious about it.
And also to be able to name it and acknowledge it, and then either accept it or work on it together.
Yeah, and this reminds me a little bit of that children's book I showed you. I forgot the title.
Of the dragon.
There Are No Dragons, or something like that. Which is an amazing book, amazing little child's book. I recommend anyone to have a look, and I'll put the link in the description. So the book essentially is about this little boy or girl, I forgot, who suddenly sees a dragon in the room. She talks about this dragon, or she mentions the dragon to her parents, and the parents say, well, that's not true because there are no dragons. And then when she just goes back to the room, and then the dragon has grown a little bit. And the next day she says again, well, the dragon is still here. No, the answer she always gets is like, no, there are no dragons. And so what's happening is that dragon keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where it's, halfway out of the house and halfway down the staircase and one legs through the windows. And then the dragon keeps growing and growing and growing to the point where it fills up the whole house. And then only then it's the point when the parents finally admit, well, okay, there is a dragon. And then when they talk about the dragon and when they address the dragon, it shrinks back down to a cuddly, cute little toy that the boy happily keeps as a pet. And the moral of the story is it's the same with problems, right? If you have a problem and you don't address it, if you don't talk about it, what typically happens is that the problem just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger until it reaches a point where you can no longer ignore it. And oftentimes, essentially always, what also happens is that if you then talk about it, that is not as much of a problem. And that's the interesting part. And so that's why having these discussions and talking about the dragon before it grows too much.
It's all consuming and damages your house.
Yes, it's super helpful and super valuable.
I think you're so right. But so why do you think some people don't want to, why do you think some people don't want to talk about these things?
Look, there's many reasons why people don't want to talk about uncomfortable topics. One is, again, they've never learned to talk about things. And the reason why they've never learned this is because in the family, in their private life, in their history, everyone else was uncomfortable talking about these things. So you never developed this culture of addressing things. And the reason why people don't want to talk about certain things is a mix of different things. It can be that you feel ashamed about certain things, like if you have certain wishes, if you have certain desires, you might think that's not okay to have. So you might feel, whether it's filthy about having a certain desire, or whether you feel like you need to be ashamed of something, or you're embarrassed about something because you think others will judge you for it. And then of course you never talk about it because you keep it to yourself, because you don't want to expose yourself. And that's one of the reasons. And then the other reason certainly is that, and I can speak from my own experience here, is that what unfortunately often happens, that you open up and then you are being rejected, or you are being ridiculed, or you are being shamed, or you are being reprimanded for something. And then of course what happens the next time, you want to avoid the pain of that.
Of course, you're definitely not going to open up and express your truth.
Correct. Past trauma is, I think, the reason number one why you don't want to open up, and why it's so hard for many people to go through it, because then your expectation of any new discussion is, okay, what will my partner think about it? And of course it's a valid concern, because it might happen that your partner will say, well, I'm not of the same opinion, or I don't think that's a good,
or I don't think that's
point
important,
of view, or I don't think that's important. Then you are exactly in that situation, right?
And then you, once again, don't feel heard, don't feel acknowledged, feel rejected or ashamed. Yeah, it's very difficult.
So what does one do when there is a point where I have one opinion or one belief, and you think, I think that's not important, or that's not important to me, or I think that's whatever? There are things where you might say, I don't think that's okay, or I think that's a good viewpoint to have.
I think that's where the mutual respect comes in. Hopefully you can love the person, accept the person enough that you can accept that you have different viewpoints, because we humans, we don't always align, we don't always have the same values, we don't always think that the same things in life are important. So I think, which is ultimately what makes us humans, right? Exactly.
Because we have different viewpoints, that we have different ideas about things, that we are different in how we do things. Otherwise it would be horribly boring.
And so it's kind of then a case of, well, you do you. You know, if that's, yes, we can talk about it, yes, you can tell me about these things, but
don't expect me to
find the same things important, to value the same things, or to spend time on the same things, but at the same time give the person the space to let them be their own individual self. I think relationships, I think you can't expect that the other person 100% meet every need, 100%.
That will never be the case.
Yeah, exactly. You know, this sort of idea that somebody is going to agree with everything you say or everything you do, I think is...
Actually, it would be quite boring if that would be the case.
So boring.
Right.
I mean, you want somebody who's going to challenge you, but...
Exactly. Or shows you different viewpoints and tries to open your worldview or your minds to new ideas. And that's one thing that I find so incredibly fulfilling about our relationship, is that we do have different ideas about things, but then we take the time to talk about it and to teach each other, so to speak.
Or even just explore what's important to the other person. Not even necessarily teach, you know. And I think it's about, let's go, right? Yeah, I think it would be incredibly boring if we agreed on everything and we were just like carbon copies of each other, and you were a boy version of me. I mean, that would be so boring. And I think that's where love comes in, where you actually
give the freedom, you give your partner the freedom to have the room to have their own ideas, their own space, their own opinions, needs that you might not agree with, but you respect the partner and to let that person be with that person, be that person, right? Let that person be an individual. And I really do believe that that's where the love comes in. Absolutely. You know, you shouldn't just love somebody just because they meet your expectations, or just because they do what you want them to do, or say what you want them to say. At the end of the day, you want to love that person for who they truly are. And which goes back to why it's so important to have these talks and have these discussions, because how do you understand who somebody truly is if they can't be vulnerable and they can't open up and they can't share who they truly are? First of all, I think it's very difficult to feel loved if you can't open up about who you truly are. And secondly, I think it's very important to
to truly love somebody if they don't let you in, because you're loving a version of them that you don't even know if it's real, or I just think it's
And a lot
very
of
difficult to know if it's authentic.
Yeah, and a lot of times that's what you hear so many times from couples that split up, from relationships that break up, where you say after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, it feels like I never knew that person. It feels like this is say someone who I don't even understand, that person that doesn't understand me. Or when someone then decides to open up about who they are, what they want, what they expect, then all of a sudden what you hear is it feels like a different person altogether, right?
And yet at the beginning of that relationship, it probably felt like it was all love, all happiness, all just this amazing alignment of souls and desires, and you go and build a life together, and yet there's this sort of underlying disconnect that just gradually, and the disconnect just gradually deepens and grows.
And that's also something I've seen in many relationships, where you fall in love with a very particular singular idea of that other person, just one particular aspect, but you ignore or you don't know about all the other things, all the other aspects of that personality and of that person. And then over the years, over the months, you discover these different sides, and you find out that you actually don't like what you're seeing here, or what you're feeling, or what you're experiencing.
No, it's amazing. Hey, love is like literally blind. I think, the initial stages of a relationship are so intoxicating and so driven, I think, by all sorts of other factors like attraction and endorphins and oxytocin and all sorts of other things that really bond one to another person. And I think maybe from an evolutionary point of view, maybe that's not a bad thing, because you're much more likely to procreate in that kind of state, have a baby. How many people after 20 years of marriage would look at their partner and think, you know what, you're definitely the kind of person that I would want to have a baby with.
Yeah.
And then it's physiologically probably improbable or impossible or unlikely. So maybe it's not a bad thing that we blind to our partner's faults. And the reality is also that nobody is perfect. Everybody has their faults. Everybody has their insecurities. Everybody has their trauma, whether it's a capital T or a little mini t. Everybody has their issues. But I think that at the end of the day, that's also what's beautiful about life, is if you can find somebody who you can have a close and meaningful relationship with, and who does accept you and does love you for who you are, and also just lets you be you.
Yeah. And so what would you say, what can people do to enable these conversations? What are practical things where you say, okay, this can help you to get to the point where you can have an open discussion about uncomfortable aspects of your life, of your emotional state, and of your being, of your existence?
I think the first thing is that one has to enter into these discussions in a very open, curious kind of state of mind. I think, and they talk about this in counseling and things like that, where your language needs to very much be, I feel, or my experience is, talking about it from your own perspective, or from how you feel about something, but in a very non-judgmental and open kind of way. I think as soon as you go into these discussions and say, you make me feel like I'm not good enough, or, that's very different to going into a discussion and saying, I feel like I'm somehow not good enough. It's a very different opening point for conversation.
Exactly.
And I think it's really difficult to be in that space and to maintain that position. But I think that's one aspect.
And that's also what's
listening to your partner's feedback, to sort of try to be aware of when you are triggered by something that they say, or triggered, and get defensive, or want to attack the person back, or hurt the person, or, so I think it's so important to be aware of your own emotional state, and what are your triggers, what are your vulnerabilities. And so when you feel that happening to yourself, to give yourself a little bit of self-compassion and sort of go, okay, this is really triggering me, and yet to still stay in the you know, for example, that makes me feel like, etc., etc., not accusing the other person. But listen, I think that these discussions are really difficult because unless your partner's got a similar kind of attitude or a similar kind of openness to these discussions, it's not going to be easy. And yet, I also believe in a rupture and repair process.
We
And
sometimes have to clash.
yeah, sometimes you've got to have a big fight or a big disagreement, or
yeah, we just find out that there is a point in your relationship that it was a blind spot that you haven't considered, haven't looked at, haven't discussed. That will happen all of your life. That's inevitable.
And so I think as long as the sort of rupture, like the big fight, I think as long as that's followed by a repair process where you go back, you know, you take the time to reflect, I think, you know, and really try and think about it from not only your own perspective, but also the other person's perspective. And just sometimes asking yourself, you know, what's the truth in all of this? I think we tell ourselves all sorts of interesting sub-stories you know, and so often you may go back and say, but you said that, and it's like the other person is like, I never said that.
Right.
Hey, thanks for joining us on our walk. Hope to see you again next time, and subscribe and like.
If you have any topics you'd like us to discuss, then leave a comment below and we're happy to try to consider it from
Next time.
next time. Exactly.